G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is watching. Let's kick it off. I've been speaking to this gentleman a number of times now. This is the fourth time he's been on the show. We're going to be speaking about the Aboriginal genocide, whether it happened or whether it didn't happen. We want to hear from this man. He's well-versed in Australian history. So let's please welcome him to the stage. Dr. Christopher Reynolds, welcome back to Commanding the Narrative, mate.
Good evening. Nice to be with you, Stephen.
These horrible British settlers coming to this country and just genociding the poor Aboriginal people, and we need reconciliation for that, and we need treaties, and we need Makarrata commissions to do some real truth-telling, and we're going to do some truth-telling tonight. So let's maybe start off with the definition of genocide. Now, if you head to the Encyclopedia Britannica, it says that genocide is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a group of people because of their ethnicity, nationality, race, or religion. The term is derived from the Greek genos, race, tribe, or nation, and the Latin side, which is killing. So that explains the term genocide. Now, when I was at school, I'm 40 years old. It wasn't that long ago, I would hope, that I was in school. I mean, they didn't teach us about Aboriginal genocide. They taught us a lot about Aborigines. There was a big focus on the Aboriginals, but you would have thought that being educated in the New South Wales education system, if there was a genocide that happened, they would have been ramming it down our throats. I'm sure that's what's happening now with our generations in school now. But this term of Aboriginal genocide, for me, seems to be a new term. It seems to have only really popped up in the last decade or two. Is that the case? Has there always been talk about an Aboriginal genocide when you've gone through the historical records?
It's a misnomer, and the word is being misused. And yet there are two aspects to the full-blood Aboriginal people disintegrating as a race. Two things. One has to do, as I've done in the book, have a very detailed look at how the race that we call Aborigines, the native tribes, the various native tribes of this nation, were incredibly violent. And that's no different to other primitive tribes, but primitive, I use in the term of being uncivilized compared to the standard in terms of industrialization, law, order, social structure, these sort of things that we sort of say, well, this is a sophisticated civil country. So a primitive society of hunters and gatherers were amazingly violent, not just in terms of intra-tribal violence, in terms of the incredible number of killings that went on between tribes, but inter-tribal violence, but intra-tribal violence. And that is all the killings that took place within a tribe. Domestic violence was absolutely massive. 1/3 of all Aboriginal women, 1/3, were beaten to death, clubbed to death. It was a common practice. If a woman gave the fellow trouble, then he just beat her to death. And an Aboriginal man could have up to 26 or more wives. So, counting them on your fingers and saying, oh, I'm now down to 23, didn't make much difference. But the other incredible thing that we miss, that apart from the violence, was the fact that by age 11, some 57% of Aboriginal children that had been born had died. 57%. I mean, that was just amazing that the children, and it was something like 25, 35% of all children within the first year died. It was just tremendous in terms of the conditions that people tried to live in a primitive society. So you've got all the internal violence, the inter-tribal violence, and some tribes were wiped out, and others were just down to a dozen people. And then you've got all the internal stuff that was going on. Now, apart from that keeping the tribal numbers low, and I mean, as I've gone through the documents, the newspaper reports, the letters, the diaries, I cannot find I cannot find, right up until Macquarie, and there must be some, but I cannot find an example of anybody writing back to England or recording in a government document of any sort of murders of Aborigines that were recorded. I mean, once we get to Macquarie, then we've got the thing of business that they're going on with the Aborigines killing people out in the Nepean area at Campbelltown. And it got to the point that Macquarie was saying, oh, well, you know, this is them and, you know, we just have to be tolerant. And I know that there's been dozens of people killed, but what can you do, etc. But the night that this group of 30 marauders who'd been raiding families and killing people, the night they cut off Mrs. Lewis's head was the line in the sand for Macquarie. And that was it. He was on his feet. He was angry. He sent 3 battalions out to find these 30 people. And even with them searching around, it was Aborigines that helped the soldiers find the 30 marauders and who was with them. And they were under strict instructions to say, surrender, surrender. And it was only if they fired upon or threw spears at the soldiers that they should defend themselves. Now, in that, there were 14 people who were actually killed, Aborigines, and a number of them actually inadvertently fell off a cliff near the river. So they weren't all shot by the soldiers. And the fellow in charge, years later, regretted. He was so sorry that those 14 people were killed. He didn't say he murdered them, and he didn't say we fired on them outside of regulations. That wasn't the case. He only was defending his people and fired upon the Aborigines after being attacked. So it's up until then I can't find. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't skirmishes, but we can't say that all Aborigines were violent, and there is no evidence of Aboriginal wars. And even a little later, where there was where the governor, and it was after oh no, it wasn't. It was Brisbane, I think, who was a lazy old fellow that liked. He was an astrologer. He liked living out of Parramatta looking at the stars. It was at the point, I'm sure it was Brisbane, who decided that there was such attacks by the Aborigines on the settlers at Bathurst, and he declared martial law to do something. Sent 75 troops out to Bathurst, and so they was basically, they marched up and down and made a noise and whatever. But not one Aborigine was killed, and the chief of the tribe was given a message to come and see the governor, which he and the tribe did. So they journeyed from Bathurst all the way to Sydney. The governor then pardoned them, bless you, my son. And then only a month later, they all attended a festival. So if anybody thinks that there was any killings at Bathurst, they are completely and utterly wrong in terms of what took place at that event, and probably wrong about what took place at Campbelltown. Now, the issue you're asking is if there was genocide. And I've said, firstly, the Aboriginal population was kept low through no fault of white settlers. The interracial, the black-on-black murders were far outstretched anything to do with black on white and white on black. But the second and most important issue that doesn't really come to a head until 1900, when they do a census of the nation, right across the nation. And the censor himself stops. It took him a few years to write it up by hand. And he stops when he comes to the issue of the Indigenous or Aboriginal people. And he notes that of the people that have been counted in the census, that now 95% of people that can be identified in any way as being Indigenous, 95% were now Creole or mixed blood. And people, only 5% of all Aboriginals in the country in 1900 were actually full-blood Aboriginal. Today, of course, it's less than 1%. So when we chase this issue, as he did, why is it that people had chosen to intermarry with white people instead of continuing to be part of their tribe? And the reason, as I can pick it up from the various writings from people like Daisy Bates and a stack of others, is that the Aboriginal women and children could not get out of primitive Aboriginal society fast enough. I mean, the poverty, the starvation, the deprivation, the disease, the injuries, the lack of medical care, the deaths of the children. 50% of your children were dead by 11, and so it went on. It was just a horrible, deprived environment to live in the bush and eat raw food, etc., etc. So people couldn't get out of it fast enough. So what's happened in Australia is what's happened in other places of the world, America, Brazil, Singapore, and that is we now have a Creole race. We have very few people in this country that are pure Aboriginal. They're there, but they're very few. So when I hear people saying, "Oh, I'm Aboriginal and I heard this story and Mary down the end of the bar told me this," how do they know? Because they're not linked and could not be linked because they're considered outsiders. So that the disintegration of the Aboriginal race, as the census said in 1900, is in full swing. And when I look at the statistics today, when 70% of married Indigenous people are married to non-Indigenous people, then we have the continuation of this slide where the Aboriginal race is on its way to extinction. It has nothing to do with people having to kill them. It's people wanting to get out of a terrible culture.
You know, I brought this up on the show before when I interviewed Kerry White, who's an Aboriginal elder out in South Australia and up in the Northern Territory, and she was telling us about how when she was younger, the Aboriginal mothers would seek out the missions just to get away from their tribe because they were well fed in the missions, they were protected, they were sheltered, they were looked after.
Yeah. When you go and find pictures of the missions, firstly, this was Christian benevolence that was in, who paid for the missions, not the government. This was people using their own money. The churches were using their funds, their staff. And as you just said, they paid for the food, the clothing, and how many people who had children, and they should know if they're going to stay in the tribe, who would leave the children at the door of the mission. And so when I found pictures of children in the mission, I first thought, well, they're all in uniform. They're all smiling for the camera. Nobody's crying, nobody's suffering. You can see the happiness that was there. So I think that the missions and the incredible work they've done over 1,500 years has been denied the praise that they deserve, because they've done a tremendous thing for humanity, regardless of the colour of their skin or what you want to call them. The churches in this instance is there for human welfare in the name of Christ, and you've got to give them the praise that they deserve for giving up their lives to do so.
So what I want to do is, first I'm going to kick off with a little bit of Wikipedia fact or fiction. And I think you've already covered some of this already, but maybe we'll just drum it in, because I think a lot of the people these days, they get their information from Wikipedia, and that's probably problematic. But then we'll go into some more credible sources as well to kind of deconstruct the narrative that's out there about these killings supposedly that happened. So the first one that I want to bring up is this Wikipedia article here, which is the genocide of Indigenous Australians. And as I said, you already touched on this a little bit, but it says when Britain established its first Australian colony in 1788, the Aboriginal population is estimated to have been 300,000 or more than 1 million people. So between 300,000 and 1 million people, comprising of 600 tribes or nations and 250 languages with various dialects. By 1901, the Aboriginal population had fallen to just over 90,000 people, mainly due to disease, frontier violence, and the disruption of traditional society. So you were saying that. All right, let's get into what we're going to talk about tonight, and that is, white settlers and things like that. So that's the reason why the population.
You run through that just again. You said violence. What were the three things you read? Why was it trade?
Disease, frontier violence.
No.
And the disruption of traditional society.
No, it wasn't disease, and it wasn't frontier. What do you call it? What was the word?
Violence. Frontier
There's nothing to the frontier. What frontier? These people have been killing each other all over the country. There wasn't any frontier. And there has never, ever, ever, ever been a war between the Aborigines and the Caucasians in this country. Never has there been such a war where Aborigines lined up 100 or more people against 100 more people. Never in this country have we had that sort of conflict. Now, the thing is that when they say moving away from traditional values or something, this is people getting out of the horrific primitive lifestyle, the Stone Age lifestyle, as fast as they can. And that was going on. Now, but you see, the moment you say, oh, there were 600,000 people, who told you that? It's not the Aboriginal culture because the tribes didn't know. It's some person in the 20th century who's sitting at a computer or has got a pen and a bit of paper who's calculating back. But it's fiction. It's just total fiction. They don't know how many people were here when Arthur Phillip landed. They do not know. And again, when they get up to the census, it would be a matter of reading the census as the hymn say, and maybe the statistics there, but that's where we would find the statistic of how many Aboriginal people. He's got the figure, someone mentioned the figure of 90,000. So what? When you look at that, if the census then gave that figure, he's saying 83% of those people were now Creole. And so you can't say they were down to 90,000. They were down to full-blooded Aborigines, 7,000. And that's how fast the race has been disintegrating. And not through disease, because they always had diseases, and it's a misnomer, a total piece of fiction that suggests that the Europeans brought diseases that killed the Aboriginal people. Absolute nonsense, because when one studies this issue, sailors were afraid coming into foreign places that they were going to catch diseases, because people pick a country, Brazil, already had immunities to a lot of diseases, and so it was the new people who would catch the local disease. And so it was also in Australia, or the British coming here. They were more afraid of picking up Aboriginal diseases than ever giving diseases to the country. So let's say there was an interchange of diseases, if that was possible. But the Aborigines already had disease that had nothing to do with foreigners coming into the country. So, the disease didn't kill them. The violence certainly did amongst themselves. There were no frontier wars, and people did want to walk away from their traditional lifestyle because it was killing them. It's there but not there.
Back to Wikipedia, and I will get off Wikipedia in a second. But this one here is called Australian Frontier Wars, and it's a whole clip about apparently the first conflict took place several months after the landing of the first fleet in January.
That's right. It's absolutely the guy's telling lies. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Where did he get his evidence? Because it's not out of any of the diaries. It's not in Philip's diary, who was the governor. It's not in the Attorney General's diary, with David Collins. It is not in the doctor's diary. It is not in King's diary. And you've got to then really get into David Collins's work and all that he wrote up, because half of his book, that you can get on, it's called, but it was published a few years after he left. He spends an amazing amount of time with the Aborigines and writes up an incredible amount of encounters. Now, where was the conflict? There wasn't the conflict. When I go through the story of Philip, you see, Philip got on incredibly well with the Aborigines when he arrived. And it was a puzzle to me, because everybody else that had come to Australia talked about being eaten or beaten. And even Cook, when he arrived at Botany Bay, said, "Oh, well, they threw their spears at us." And that was interesting. And I think, what's his name? Banks Joseph picked up a few and took them home, which has recently sort of shown up in things. But Philip did. Cook just found it all fascinating, really. That they're throwing their javelins at us, he said, sort of thing. But he got back on the boat. When Philip arrives, when you read his diary, he says he's out of the boat and he's on the beach. He's got Gidley King behind him, and here's some Aborigines, and he wants to say, "G'day, fellas." And the Aborigines are looking at these fellas all dressed up in their red uniforms and their hats, and really don't know what they're looking at. And he smiles at them, and the Aborigines go, and this is what happened. The Aborigines go, they go into shock, and he says to Gidley, "What's happening?" Gidley says, "I don't know what's happening, but don't stop doing it." And when I tried to work out what was going on, was it because he was short? Was it because he had sort of olive skin, because he had German? Was he doing sign languages because he spoke 5 languages? And what it was, he was missing his front tooth. And when he smiled, all the Aborigines smiled back at him, who were also missing their front tooth, because it was a mark of the process from boyhood to manhood. And so they basically said, well, we know which tribe he's from, and he certainly dresses funny, but he's obviously of somebody's tribe. And so what you read officially is how instantly he got on with the Aborigines. And it says that he walked around Botany Bay with the Aborigines, deciding on where he was going to park his big canoe. And they said, it's a bit shallow there, Philip, you won't get it in over there. Oh, and there's mangroves over there, and I don't think the council's going to let you park your big canoe in amongst the mangroves. And I think, as I read it and studied it, it was the Aborigines that suggested that he go up to Port Jackson. Because when the fleet was arriving, he was rowing out in a pinnace, he knew where he was going, up to Port Jackson. When he pulled into Port Jackson, the same thing happened. He got on so well with the Aborigines that they sat on the beach for 2 days and chatted before he said, "Now, I'm going back to get the bigger canoes and we'll all be back in a couple of days." And they all waved him goodbye. There was absolutely no violence whatsoever. And Philip records the interactions with the chief around the cooking pot and how the chief was impressed with them all boiling meat. Now, when it moves on a bit further, there's a kerfuffle with the rush cutters, but they had actually killed some people before the Aborigines killed them. And Philip went back and said to the rest of the community, "You will stay away and you will not hurt the Aborigines." Now, it's a bit further on that there's a whale that's come up on the beach at Manly, and Philip goes over on the invitation of Bennelong to get a piece of the meat. And there's some old Aboriginal that doesn't know what's going on, and Philip puts out his hands and said, "Hi, I'm here." And the fellow throws his spear. Well, the spear goes through Philip's shoulder. He almost dies in the event. The Aboriginals run off, and Philip lives. They take him back to hospital. And 2 months later, Bennelong shows up and he says, "I'm really sorry for what happened. We found the guy who threw the spear. Do you want us to take revenge?" And Philip says, No, you mustn't take revenge on him. And Bennelong is so impressed with Philip's attitude that he then brings other Aborigines to live in the community. A Spanish, and this is only recent, a Spanish naval, a captain, it must have been a merchant, shows up in Sydney, and this is 1793. And he is in Sydney. He's been invited to the governor's house to have a meal. And he writes in his diary, or his log, that's been recently translated in the last 7 or 8 years or something. He says, "When I got to Sydney," he said, "I couldn't believe it." He said there were children, Aboriginal children and Caucasians playing in the street in the little town. I couldn't believe it. He said, "I went to dinner and sat down with the governor, and there I was sitting with Aborigines having dinner in the governor's house." He said, "It's the most integrated place I've been to in the world." Now, there's no violence there, and that's recorded by a Spanish merchant. And then when I went into the whole thing of how many Aborigines integrated in society, and I wrote it up in my book, and there's a guy called, I'm going to forget his name, Banaloo, I think, no, I'm going to get it wrong. But he was there, and he got a number of 27 of the officers' uniforms, and he would entertain the ships coming in, and I wrote him up as Australia's first tourist agent, and there he was saying, and he'd take off the government, and he'd walk up and down. Well, he was still there, and he was running an Aboriginal farm at the time of Macquarie. And I found in Macquarie's diary where he says, Oh, we've just had a celebration, the annual celebration for the children that are in the Aboriginal school. Oh, says Elizabeth, we must go out and give Banneroo some food. So they get on the barge and they take up cattle and ducks and things to the Aboriginal farm. And we have totally missed the success of the integration. And there is one person that I found who was a problem to the community, and I'm going to forget his name too. It's a guy, Willamere or something. But it turns out he was a lunatic. He caused everybody problems. And eventually, it wasn't that he started a war against the settlers. Aboriginal people so hated him that they came across people of his own tribe. And it says they murdered them and they raped the women to the point of exhaustion. That's how much they hated this man that was considered the leader of the frontier wars. And so this fellow went and injured a man that had a nickname of Collins, and then another big Aboriginal fellow by the name of Big Caesar then found him and he killed him. And the guy was dead in 1895. So, I mean, he was only sort of on the fringes of things. There were never any frontier wars with the Aborigines. And it's just not true.
Let me bring you this. This is the website for the Australian Museum. Now, now this was written. I guess this sentence here means it was written by a librarian and essayist, whatever. I don't know what.
Yeah, what qualifications they go? Come on.
Yeah. All right. So, and I'm slowly reading this article, and it's talking about the killings, and it's got all these these images here, and it's referring to some of these sources. So I go down to the bottom, and it's got these sources here, right? So, this is where the rabbit hole starts. Now, one of the sources is this article from The Guardian that was written. It's called "The Killing Times: The Massacres of Aboriginal People Australia Must Confront." And it's even, as you scroll down, it's even got this map here where it shows you all the massacres that happened since 1770.
That's just rubbish. I can't help myself. I mean, I can't help myself. How did they get this? Firstly, they define massacre as where 3 people were killed. Okay, that's 3 people killed. Why were they killed? Oh, well, and when I examined this recently with another guy that was doing the same thing, and I looked through the references as you did, when I got down to his references, I mean, I think, why did you put these references in? It says, man was killed by native police, that is Aborigines, because he was wanted for theft of cattle and he resisted arrest. That's a massacre. When the police actually shoot someone, that he may, whatever that is, that is not a massacre. A massacre is when, as you pointed out earlier, is when you purposely go in to murder people who don't know it's happening and no way to defend themselves. If you're talking about a war, resistance, etc., where you've got unarmed people, the massacres were the cadres of Aborigines that attacked family homes and murdered women and children night after night. People talk to me about the Tasmanian massacres. I said it was absolutely terrible, wasn't it? 250 white settlers were murdered in just 5 years. It was disgusting. And people look at me like, what are you talking about? I said, well, why do you think they walked through Tasmania trying to clear out the Aborigines who'd already gone? And they only got 1 man and a boy. I said, because the massacres of the white settlers had got to a point of being totally intolerable. If we had 25 people massacred in a town today by the bikies or someone, the nation would be in an uproar. But 250 settlers had been literally massacred, unarmed women and children killed in the night. So talk to me about massacres. You know, it just makes me absolutely ill that they don't understand who was actually initiating the violence. The other thing go on.
Mate, I'm only halfway through the rabbit hole.
All right, give me the rest and I'll try to be quicker.
As I'm trying to, click through these articles, I come to this one here. This is from ABC News. More evidence of genocidal killings of Aboriginal people in frontier times. University of Newcastle research reveals. So as I'm reading this article, this name pops up. that I'd noticed in a few of the articles that I've gone through already. This Professor Lyndall Ryan from the University of Newcastle. So I'm like, oh, here's a thread that I can click on. So I typed in this Professor Lyndall Ryan, and this clip here comes up, which is, I think, very interesting. So let's play this, and then I'll get your comments from there.
All right.
Historians' footnotes. Wind Shuttle uncovers damning evidence of fudged figures and exaggerated claims.
Well, in some cases, there are claims by the historians I'm criticising that can be shown to be absolutely false. People who were supposed to be on the spot were somewhere else. And there are other cases where historians, Lyndall Ryan has made a whole range of claims about events that happened, and she's given footnotes to them, as historians are supposed to do. And when you look up the footnotes, you find there's nothing there.
There are a couple of references missing, but they are readily found in the archives and can be checked. And he's chosen not to do that.
Lyndall Ryan cites the diary of the colony's first chaplain, the Reverend Robert Knopwood, as the source for her claim that between 1804 and 1808, colonists killed 100 Aborigines. The diaries, however, record only 4 Aborigines being killed in this period.
It's a devastating claim Ryan cannot refute.
Right. I certainly agree that the Knopwood diaries say that, but I also had another reference referring to a report by John Oxley, who was a surveyor. He said too many Aborigines were being killed.
Okay, but how did you extrapolate from his words saying too many Aborigines had been killed to about 100 lost their lives?
Well, I think by the way in which Oxley wrote that he seemed to think there had been a great loss of life from the Aborigines.
So in a sense, is it fair enough for him to say that you did make up figures? You're telling me you made an estimate.
But historians are always making up figures.
Can you believe? So this is the woman driving this research. This is why you're getting articles in The Guardian, and you're getting these maps showing all the massacres, and you're getting articles in the ABC. It's all based off this woman's research from the University of Newcastle, and she goes on a national broadcast. I don't know what year this was from, but it looks a bit dated, and she says that historians make things up. She's admitting that she's making this stuff up.
Yeah, she is. And while, I mean, the thing is, you see, when I set out to do this project, my background is that I was one of the first people in Australia, when I was going through university, who chose to do a course in Aboriginal studies. Flinders University decided to put it on. I was doing my Dip Ed, and I enjoyed it. And then I worked with Don Dunstan on helping the Pitjantjatjara people get a piece of land as big as Britain, as big as England. And so I went off to America to do my PhD, having done all the background work. And the year I left, it actually passed the Parliament in South Australia. And I've been with Aboriginal people, etc. But they're humans. They're nothing special. They're Australians. That's good. So am I. I'm a native Australian, etc. But you see, when I wanted to come at this project, I didn't have an opinion. I don't have any political agenda to push with writing about the Aborigines. It's a subject that needs to be cleared up in terms of what's being said. But so I got into diaries and newspaper reports as much as I could to actually find the truth. Now, when that woman said, "Oh, Oxley said this," but wait a minute, I thought you were talking about killings in 1804. Well, yes. Well, Oxley didn't arrive till after 1810. And his walking around as an explorer was in the 1815 to 16. You've got your dates wrong. So Oxley had nothing to do with any killings that took place. And if you get out a map and have a look at the size of the colony in 1804, it's a pinpoint on the map. It really isn't. It wasn't until you get to Hamilton Hume, and that again is in 1815, that you've got any exploration over the Blue Mountains that Hamilton Hume, as a teenager, told Wentworth and Blackstone and Lawson what to do. But they only got up to the top and turned around and said, "Oh, it's too tight. We'll have to go back now." They didn't even cross it. So Evans, the surveyor, was then told by Macquarie to get Hamilton and go over and map it all the way down. And then it was Hamilton humans, of course, that went all the way down to Melbourne. So there's no expansion until after 1815. So if you want to talk about massacres around Sydney, it's rubbish, because the colony was just so small, and who was killing who? I mean, they'd already been there and knew everybody, and the Aborigines were already integrated. So she's not just wrong. It becomes fabrication.
Well, the thing is, she's admitting that she's fabricating it. She just said historians make stuff up. So
yeah. Here's the other thing. Here's another little thing. I throw this in. When I have found, like, there was an event with the Australian Agricultural Company when they took land at Port Macquarie, and there was an event where the fellows that went up to survey it and mark it out did actually kill some Aborigines. So, all right, let me get into the diaries and the notes and the newspaper reports. So again, what actually happened was that the Aborigines attacked them, killed some fellow, and in self-defence, the white settlers defended themselves and attacked the Aborigines. Now, here's the funny thing that I don't understand with what I hear. And again, I'm hearing it from people that are Creole. They're not full-blood Aborigines and have got no right to talk about what happened in the past. And the other thing is that if they were full-blood Aborigines, they do not have any lineage to grandfather or anybody belong. They don't know who their great-grandfathers were, and any dates and facts that they roll out are given to them by white people, not Aborigines. But here's the thing. Under Aboriginal law, which is custom, if indeed I suffer some atrocity to myself and I go and kill somebody, an Aboriginal, it's called revenge killing. So if an Aboriginal attacks the white settlers and they then kill the Aborigines, under Aboriginal law, that's revenge killing. Why are you making a fuss? Oh, the people at the time aren't making the fuss. It's academics sitting in Newcastle who are putting words in their mouths and emotions in their heart that are saying it must have been like this or must have been like that. And they're speculating. They're nowhere near the truth of the matter.